Welcome to part 3 of sewing our space leotard sewing pattern. Available at katkow.net. In this video, we will continue sewing the body of the leotard, the crotch and attach the bra cups. For instructions on sewing the shell and lining, installing boning, and adding the zipper, go back and watch part 2. Let's get started. Once you have your shell and lining layers sewn, position them over each other with the right sides of the fabrics facing each other. Make sure everything lines up at the top seams around the front and back of the leotard. Add pins all around the top edge of the leotard to hold the shell and lining in place. We're only going to sew from the center back top edge to the front bust. Use a straight stitch when sewing over the non-stretch fabric pieces. However, when you reach sides number 3 and 4, switch to a stretch stitch, then back to a straight stitch for number 2. Sew the top edge using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. You will also sew the center front piece between the bust, but do not sew the bust curves together. Repeat for both sides, then remove the pins. Now, flip the shell and lining right side out. Once turned right side out, place pins around the top edges of the leotard and along the sides of the zipper, pinning the shell and lining together. Sew the shell and lining together at the zipper sides first, then work up the top edge of the leotard. Remember to switch to a stretch stitch when sewing over the stretch fabric sections. Thread hack: if using black and a light-colored fabric, top stitch with the lighter thread, then use a fabric marker to color over the light thread where it overlaps black fabric. You can choose to color in the thread on the lining side as well. Next, you want to install a hook and eye at the top of the zipper to keep the ends neatly in place and make it easier to zip up. Hand sew the hook and eye on opposite sides, only grabbing the lining fabric with your needle. Take your time and add many loops to secure each piece nicely to the lining. Once done, we can continue with the bust. You can now sew the bust shell and lining together. However, do not follow the 1/2 inch seam allowance. Sew them together as close to the edge as possible. We will use the 1/2 inch seam allowance for sewing on the bra cups later. You can also serge these if you wish, but do not trim off the seam allowance. Now we can work on the crotch. You can sew on the number 7 pieces to the shell and lining crotches as if you wish. Or you can reduce or extend the length if you need less or more room in the area. However, we're going to modify it so that it opens and closes using a 3-hook wide bra extender. We're simply going to use the ends of the number 7 piece to attach to the ends of the bra extender. Make sure to add seam allowance to the new ends that will be sewn to the extender. For the bra extender, we only need the elastic and hooks that connect together. You can remove the unnecessary ends that come with the extender by using a seam ripper. Use the new paper pieces to cut your shell and lining fabric. You may need to true out the curves so they blend into the extender. The hook should be facing outside, while the soft side will face your skin or body. You can then attach the crotch ends to the front shell and lining of the leotard and sew with extra stitches for security. Then sew the extender in between the shell and lining. And repeat for the back side. You may need to cut slits along the curves to match up the ends up nicely. Once your crotch pieces are attached, we can continue with the leg holes. We will sew the leg holes together using bias tape or trim. First, pin the shell and lining together at the seams to make sure everything lines up nicely. Then unfold your bias tape and position it so the right side of the tape is facing the right side of the leotard shell. Starting at the crotch extender, fold in the beginning of the bias tape, then pin it all around the leg hole, stopping at the back crotch extender. When you reach the back, fold in the ends of the bias tape similarly to the front. Then sew the bias tape to the leg hole using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Use a stretch stitch when sewing over the stretch fabric. Once sewn, fold and press the bias tape over to the lining side, then pin or use clips to hold everything in place. Then top stitch or edge stitch the folded bias tape layers all around the leg hole. You can then repeat for the opposite leg hole. Now let's work on the bra cups. The bra cups are made up of 3 pieces, numbers 8, 9, and 10. Use the interfacing pieces 8i, 9i, and 10i for the rigid interfacing and foam layers. These are similar but without seam allowance. For the bra shell, cut it out of 2 types of faux leather or vinyl fabric. Use black vinyl for the bottom cups and green vinyl for the top cup. For the lining, use a black non-stretch fabric similar to the lining of the leotard body. For the interfacing layers, you will need one set cut out of intimate foam and another set cut out of rigid interfacing, either fusible or non-fusible. However, we will not be fusing the interfacing, just layering them for structure. Sew the shell pieces together first. Sew pieces 8 and 9 together, right sides facing each other, aligning at the center notch. And sew with a straight stitch using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once sewn, lightly press the seams to one side with a low heat iron and use layers of muslin to protect the vinyl from melting. Next, sew the number 10 pieces to the top of the bottom cups, aligning the center notch of number 10 to the seam of 8 and 9. Stack them right sides facing each other and sew with a straight stitch. Once sewn, lightly press the seams. Repeat the same steps for sewing the lining bra cup pieces. Remember to sew the lining in the opposite direction, as the right side of the lining should touch your skin. Once your lining is sewn, stack the lining and shell right sides facing each other. Sew only the top side and top edge of the cup. Use the notches included on the pattern as guides for where to start and stop sewing. Once sewn, trim off excess fabric around the corners and notches. Then flip the cups right side out, lightly press, and clip them to hold the fabric in place. For the foam interfacing, sew these pieces together side by side using a zigzag stitch. Do this for both the bottom cups and when attaching the top cup. Repeat the same stitching method for the rigid interfacing pieces. Now, layer the inside of the cups. Position the foam layer under the rigid layer, with the rigid interfacing behind the shell fabric. When positioning the inside layers, make sure the shell and lining seams are positioned behind the interfacing and foam. At this point, you can adjust the layers and match up the bottom edges of the lining and shell. If you're doing drag, you may want to add extra padding to the bust. If you have a natural bust, you can skip additional inserts. For this tutorial, we will add 2 pre-made bra cup inserts behind the foam layer toward the lining. Clip or pin the bottom edge of the lining and shell together. Push away the padding so you don't sew over it with the machine. You'll be able to readjust the padding after sewing. Sew the shell and lining fabric together along the bottom edge of the cup, as close to the edge as possible. Do not follow the 1/2 inch seam allowance yet, as we will use that later. You can also serge this bottom edge, but do not remove or cut off the seam allowance. Once sewn, repeat for the opposite bra cup. Now we can attach the bra cups to the body of the leotard. With the right sides of the cup facing the right side of the body, align the bust seams to the number 1 and 2 seams. Then clip or pin the cup all around the bust edge. Sew using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once sewn, top stitch under the bust to create a tunnel for the underwire. Insert your underwire if desired. This is optional, but it helps keep the structure of the cup. Then repeat for the other cup. You can choose to keep and use the leotard as is at this point. However, in our next video, we will sew the harness and shoulder pieces, as well as the hip flare pieces.